We have got some time if people want to throw out questions, and Jamie and Steve can answer them now. Or, of course, then there is back to the tasting, retaste the wines based on what you've listened to. Jamie and Steve will be up there as well to mingle around, so you can certainly have individual questions. But for the moment now, is there any questions? Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, I've got two. The first one is, I was quite surprised to see, sorry, this isn't a criticism, just there was no Riesling in the tasting. And talking about aromatic,
Yep.
not showing minerality, I think Riesling is aromatic and tends to show minerality. That's one question.
Yeah, that's a good question. To be honest, we were thinking of putting Schloss Johannesburg in here, and we tasted one of their wines, and because of the thing for me particularly is because it is so aromatic, and sometimes even with the dry wines there's a little bit of residual sugar, I don't pick up this concept of minerality as much in Riesling. It's just something that I don't get, and so it's a very personal choice.
Not Alsace?
Alsace is volcanic, as what you're saying, and maybe we could have put an Alsace in, but again we had to do it in a very short spectrum, really. So I really wanted to show some wines that showed it in a more distinct way, and I think with Riesling and Alsace, it's maybe not as obvious. It is there, definitely. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just saying that I had to pick some wines that really showed a point that we have some minerality in the wines.
If I can be greedy and ask a second one, do you think older wines tend to lose some of that minerality? I noticed with the 2015 Ribeiro wine,
Yeah.
I thought it was a lovely wine, very interesting, but I wouldn't personally have described it as minerally, because I thought it had got the tertiary flavours had taken over.
I totally agree with you. Yes, I think with age, wines tend to maybe lose that initial minerality, which maybe then points it towards it being a fermentation or maybe a sulfidic issue. I don't know. But I deliberately showed an older vintage of a Listan. Listan is always meant to be drunk young, so I've shown a 17 Listan, and I think it still showed minerality. So I think with the 15 Salvace, there's possibly a combination of the two, but I think probably the biggest blurring factor is, even though the oak is older, it's in there, and I think that probably suppressed the minerality more than the age.
Oh, quick one about mineral vessels. You've talked a bit about the different vessels for winemaking. I'd like to know your perspective of if you think using concrete or clay actually adds a sensation of minerality to a wine.
Yes, I think it does. I think it does add a definite feeling of minerality. I don't think they're totally neutral, and I do pick up an extra level of minerality in the wine. So yeah, I would say yes, amphora and concrete egg or online concrete vats. Yes, absolutely.
And I guess I'd add to that what I agree totally, but I also think that what you're having when you're working with these vessels is you're not using oak. So I guess that's another factor. So you're removing a masking factor, because I think one of the very mineral wines we had was stainless steel today. So, but I think they do add something. Yeah.
You were suggesting earlier on that fruit tended not to be so present in wines in which minerality was more pronounced.
Yes.
But in the first few wines, I certainly got a really strong kind of citrus note, so citrus and lemon. And I wonder whether you think minerality enhances that, brings it out, or is it, is that coincidental? What's going on there?
It's a good question. Maybe it is. Maybe wines that display minerality have got low pH, high acid anyway. So, and I think certainly on the Vidiano is very citric, and it's grown on calcium heavy soil. So maybe it's a combination of the two. So I don't really know. I'm not the scientist. I actually see what you're saying. He's the scientist.
I'd say that there's a strong correlation between citrus fruit characters and lower ripeness levels. So maybe you still get mineral characters in wines that exhibit citrus fruit, but once you get to higher ripenesses and the fruits tend to go more orchard or like pear, melon, peach sort of style, then I think then maybe the higher ripeness level is the thing that you're getting rather than the fruit obscuring the minerality. You're just getting higher ripeness, and so higher ripeness tends to lose some of those characters that we describe as mineral.
Is there like a one-to-one correlation between the soil type and the minerality that you find in the wine? Do you always find basalt flavors with basalt soil, or is it a case of you recognize the flavor of basalt soils within the wine?
Speaking personally, I don't think I'm that specific in a way. I just get a sensation of minerality, and I'd be hard pushed to say, oh, well, that's basalt, and that's maybe calcium I'll get, or calcium base, but I think it's just a feeling of minerality. So I'm not that specific and that prescriptive. I push it over to Jamie, see what he says.
Yeah, I think you've got to separate out the character that we describe as mineral, and then the character in a wine that we recognize as a wine that comes from predominantly that sort of soil type. So if I tasted a Touriga Nacional from, I can think of Val Miao in the Douro, where they have granite and they have alluvial soils and they have typical Douro schist on the same property, and they vinify the wine separately. You can recognize the Touriga Nacional from the granite by its character as much brighter, floral, linear like this, whereas the schist is more luxurious and round. So it's in a sense that on one level we're saying we think these soils are producing mineral wines, but also on another level these soils are giving a certain almost character to the wines that is soil derived, albeit indirectly, that we can associate then later on with the soil type.
Hi, you mentioned lots of experiments, which was great, but I just wondered, is anyone playing around with hydroponics and, dosing up, the nutrients in different ways and seeing how that impacts on the flavour or structure or aromatics?
That's really interesting, and you wouldn't really have to. It would be really not a massively expensive experiment to do. As long as you weren't having to wait for. Obviously, if we're looking at flavour of the wine, then it's a long-term experiment, and it would be impossible to do because you've got to do the vinification, and there's all sorts of problems with microvinifications. They're very difficult to do well, and so there's so many confounders from that. But to look at the effect of to use some sort of marker, even just looking like the what's in the sap, what's taken up by the roots in different. Hydroponic situations. It would be a really interesting experiment. I'm not aware of anyone that's done it.
Yeah, and just related to that, I know Maltman talks about potassium being a nutrient that's relatively, taken up in relatively high quantities, although all of them are minuscule according to him. But I certainly know that, producers talk about, with volcanic soils, getting a lot of texture and fatness in the wines, and that's something I certainly noticed with wines from the Azores, and I wondered if that's something that you found. I certainly noticed it in the list down, actually, when you tasted that. Definitely had this sort of sense of fatness and texture. I think minerality comes into that as well.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think with the Azores, with the Viñatigo, I mean, there's high potassium in that vineyard, I know that. So that's probably the reason for that, but in Thalicitis, which is probably the fullest bodied of all of those wines, there's no potassium, or very low potassium. So there's something else going on there that I don't know what it is, but I think it would be great to experiment, as you said, with hydroponics, and maybe look to see if there is a correlation with mineral uptake. And I think it would be a good counterbalance to what Alex Maltman is saying about it's not possible, and maybe try to see if it is possible, but as we don't know that anybody's doing this at the moment.
We've got a question. We've got a question from Instagram. It seems to me that any influence on the wine directly from the soil, e.g. taking up mineral from the soil, is nuanced and likely difficult to detect. From the discussion, it seems more likely that, broadly speaking, minerality is a set of characteristics that simplistically associate. Does Jamie think with enough quality studies we could find correlation between dominant factors and more accurately identify minerality?
Look, I think it's doing stuff with when the readout is sensory, as in, you know, you're looking at the result in a wine. Any experiment is like difficult and fraught with so many variables, it's very hard to control them. If you were really smart and you had lots of money, I think definitely we could do this. But it would take a really good experimental design and quite a lot of money and quite a bit of time to do it. If anyone's a bazillionaire, I've got a list of maybe 25 research projects I'd love to do. So any bazillionaires who, you know, hire me and will solve all these problems, you know, it would be great. It would be exceptionally great fun. I don't know if it would help us at all, but it would be fun to find out.
Just a comment further to the white wines as they age. In comparison, reds, particularly lighter reds, so Pinot Noir, for example, I always see New or Old World, I tend to see minerality or taste minerality. And I was thinking some aged Burgundies in particular, you start to see more mineral characteristics or tertiary characteristics. What are your thoughts?
I think the lighter the wine, and Pinot Noir is a wine that should be lighter, will display more of where it comes from, definitely. And with age, probably that skeleton, if you like, will appear. I think if it's masked with oak or with lots of primary fruit, I tend to agree that after a period of time, that minerality may come through, that skeleton may come through, but then it may also be disguised by these tertiary aromas, which can be quite full on, you know, these leathery flavors or Brett or whatever it is. It may disguise it. So it's a difficult thing, but I think lighter reds show more minerality.
Or even heavier grape varietals, so Malbec, but handled in a more lighter fashion, picked earlier, maybe on sandy soils, you'll tend to see some chance of a mineral nuance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I know that Raj Parr recently, I did an article for a new publication that's coming out fairly soon called Little Wine, and Raj Parr gave me a quote where he was saying basically that he thinks that a lot of, I think, Burgundies, and I don't want to misquote him, but he's saying that, you know, often they're, in the young, they're tight and maybe there's some oak there, but you don't get the minerality. But that recedes, as you were suggesting, you know, with time, and suddenly, yes, so that's where the minerality is. You know, a great site will reveal itself, even though the winemaking has attempted to obscure it.
Any more?
Do you think it's possible to find minerality in other styles of wine, like sparkling wine or rosé wine?
Yes, I think it is. There's absolutely no reason why you can't find minerality in rosé wine. It's a red wine that's been a very small amount of skin contact. The juice is the juice, if you like, and if there's any mineral content that's been taken up from the soil, it should display itself in rosé wine. If it's been made in a serious fashion with relatively low crop vineyards, I think that's something that we haven't mentioned. I think the lower the crop, the more concentration of these sort of elements, if you like, these minerals, you're going to see. If it's a commercial rosé, you probably won't see it, but if it's a serious rosé, you will see it. And I think you see it in some serious rosés now. That Sichel's wines, his rosés are quite intense. Certainly, the higher up you go. And I think with sparkling, absolutely. I mean, there's no reason. I mean, you see minerality in good English sparkling wines, and you see it in good champagne.
Yeah, New Year's Eve, I have a very nice friend who opened up a full set of all the Lieu-dit from Celos, 6 of them. So we smashed those. And tell you that some of those are pretty mineral. Maybe I was just biased by the fact that it was kind of a bit of a treat. But they're lower yields, you know, they're considerably lower yielding, those vines, and the result was, yeah, I think, totally.
Any more? Oh.
Do you think that you can make a wine with selected, like cultured yeast, and still display minerality?
Can a wine made with cultured yeast still display minerality?
Yes. I don't think it's just... I mean, a natural yeast will possibly show more terroir and more of an indigenous flavour, but there's no reason why a yeast won't display them, or it shouldn't get in the way of showing the actual base minerals that are in that wine, or the soil that it's coming from. I absolutely don't think that.
The vast majority of cultured yeast were selected from a wild ferment in the first place anyway, and since then they've just been, you're just getting a single strain, so maybe you'll lose a bit on complexity, and I guess also what you lose is that early part of the ferment, which is kind of significant, I guess, where you've got all the different wild yeast species before a Saccharomyces takes over and finishes things off. So you've got maybe 4 days of all sorts of yeast species doing their thing, and then Cerevisiae just finishes it off, and you're going straight to Cerevisiae. So you're losing something there. But I think sometimes the idea that cultured yeast can't make interesting wines, I think is very questionable. I think sometimes it's in our ideological position as well. I think it's good to be open-minded. A lot of the great wines I've tried have come from inoculated yeast. I mean, I was saying to Steve the other day, I remember when, was it Erasmus's, wild ferment? And this is like something that Steve was involved with. I remember in the 90s, this was like, holy, what is this? It's a wine made with a wild ferment? That's crazy. This is like, in the mid-90s, this was like a big deal. Now we're very used to the idea of wild ferments from New World wines. At that stage, in the New World, it was almost unheard of.
It was the first from Chile,
yeah,
for sure. Yeah, yeah. I mean, we have a combination of cultured yeast and wild yeast here, and I think, the first wine, Vidiano, is a cultured yeast, and it shows minerality, and Vignatigo is a wild yeast, and I think Alcantara is a wild yeast. They show minerality. The wine that shows the most minerality is Thalassites, which is a cultured yeast. But it's a cultured yeast from 6 strains from within the vineyard, as Jamie said. So there's no such thing as good and bad cultured yeast in a way. It's a different flavour, but it depends on how strong the minerality is in the area, I think. But I love wild yeast, but I don't have a downer on cultured yeast either.
Do we have any more? Or one more question? One more question. This lady over there.
So a lot of the discussions seem to link sort of minerality and terroir kind of implicitly. And I wonder, is it possible, do you think, to pick apart those notions of terroir and minerality? Could you have a mineral wine that's not a terroir wine and vice versa?
I think it would be difficult. I think maybe we are talking about terroir, and a big part of terroir is, I think, is the soil. So I think the soil and terroir are inextricably linked. I think they're together. I can't separate them.
Yeah, I mean, could Yellowtail or Jacob's Creek make a mineral wine? And it's hard to see how they could really, unless they
made a terroir wine, which
yes,
is reduce the yields and plant it on. So
that might be a way to get through the picking apart what's from the soil versus the winemaking element of minerality. Then
it's a very good point. It's a really good point. I mean, I've yet to see I don't think I've personally tasted a mass-produced wine from high-yield vineyards that have ever shown me minerality or terroir, to be honest. So, it's a difficult one.